So you've been involved in this line of work for a long time. Can you talk to me a little bit about your career, how long it's been in this particular position and what came before?
Absolutely. So I'll start off because I can't start without talking about my upbringing in childhood. I was a witness to attempted murder of my mother when I was 9 years old, and I had to testify against my stepfather at the time. And it was a really traumatic experience that 9, testifying, and I remember the victim advocates and the other folks in the court who were helping me along, and I was like, wow, I want to do something like that. And whenever you'd ask a kid, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's like a judge or a lawyer or some cliche, and I was like, I just want to help people. And fast forward, I had experience with the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system growing up in my adolescence. I had a pretty tumultuous kind of childhood, and I know my mother, she did the best that she could, but I definitely went astray a few times, and so with that I had my own experiences within the system. When I went to college for my undergrad, I studied Spanish, and I was able to travel abroad to Argentina, and I lived in Mexico teaching English, and so I decided I wanted to keep going and focus more on criminal justice, as that was my passion. And so I went ahead and got my master's degree in criminology and then kept going. And while I was in my master's program, I met he was a commander of a police department, and he and I were talking about my future goals. And he recommended the victim advocacy program at the police department, and I applied for that position and got it. And so I became a victim advocate for Aurora Police Department in Colorado. And in 2012, as you may remember, there was the theater shooting, and I was a responder as a victim advocate to the hospital. And so I had my work start there, and I was able to get my foot in the door. And then I went on to pursue my PhD, and I worked for Human Services. I also was the director for a program in the city and county of Denver that supervised pre-adjudicated youth, did pretrial for youth, and that's where I got my foundation. So really, when I talk about the personal experience, I think that weighs into the professional and the why behind all the work that I do. And I was in a group home at 13, and in that group home, there was somebody who worked there was a manager in the group home. And fast forward, I ended up supervising that person later on in my career, working for the state of Colorado. And it was ironic that I had that trajectory as a child and then as a supervisor as an adult. And so I always tell youth and other staff, like, you never know where somebody will end up or where they might end up. And always, treating people kind, because you never know, this could be your future supervisor. And so I really like to tell that story, especially with youth and young girls, because sometimes we get focused on the fact that, we are a victim of the circumstances instead of the survivor. And you have to make that choice to move forward. And so that's a little bit about my background. I moved here to Portland in 2023. I started my role here at DCJ in December 2022 and relocated with my family from Colorado for this position. And what brought me here was the excitement of working for the county, Multnomah County, and their progressive views and the focus on inclusivity and belongingness. And it was something that I was like, who wouldn't want to work in a place that uplifts these values, and I share the same values? And so I got the position, moved my young family here, and have been here since, and I think it was one of the best decisions I've made for my career. It's been really exciting working here in Multnomah County. It's very, very unique. The 36 different counties in the state, and then you also have OYA and how we all work together. There's a lot of intricacies. It's taken a lot of time to learn, but I have an amazing staff, and I am just fortunate to be able to work with such amazing people every day.
So you came into the picture here after the changes to Measure 11.
Correct.
What did you learn about the ways that Oregon is different and does things differently from other states that you've worked in similar capacities?
You know, I think that the waiver process is one that Colorado had to experience, very similar. What I realize is that there are unintended impacts of legislation such as SB 1008. The unintended impact is that kids get held in the system a little bit longer. And I have a good example of that here in our detention facility. We have a couple youth who've been here for over 900 days. And youth who are held on their pre-adjudicated charges, so the youth who are pre-adjudicated and not yet sentenced in the adult language, those youth get stuck in some cases in the system. And, you know, we have had to be creative because previously kids would move through the system quicker. And I think that that would give resolve to some, especially on the victim side, some families. However, now it just takes a long time to waive into the adult court. And there's a lot of uncertainty with that. And so, you know, I know that it hasn't been widely studied yet, the impact of SB 1008, but I think it's something important that we talk about, especially being the chair of the Juvenile Justice Policy Commission. It's something that is important that we look at how the current policies impact the current state of juvenile justice in this example.
So because the waiver process, I mean, there really haven't been any cases that have been waived into the adult system since this was passed.
There have been.
There have been?
There
Okay.
have been.
I was told that there haven't been any. Do you know of any?
In Multnomah County, we've had a couple, and maybe I can get you some examples later on.
Yeah, that would be great.
But we have had some pretty significant, serious cases. There was definitely one in Washington County that was pretty popular that I can send you the article.
Yeah, it'd be good to know about those. And so, but you're saying it just because it's so difficult to get that waiver that they end up staying in the system longer if the defense, I mean, if the prosecutor is looking for that waiver?
Right, and so what happened is that the change, you have to start at juvenile court and make a case as to why the case should move to adult court. And so that process can take a lot of time. There's a lot of discovery. Sometimes with law enforcement, there's been some backlog with reporting, and then with the district attorney. And you also had the shortage of public defenders. All of that impacts how a case moves through, and especially if it's going through a waiver process, the parties are different.
And so, yeah, so basically they get stuck in juvenile detention in the county for longer than...
Correct. Or they're stuck in pre-adjudication stage, pre-adjudicated status, if that makes sense, for longer than what they were before.
What are some of the impacts on that? I mean, you mentioned the victims' families that don't get closure there, and what are some of the impacts on the youth that's going through that process?
Well, the biggest impact is that, for example, the youth who are serving over, let's say, 500 days here in detention, their time that they're serving does not count towards the time that they get when they're sentenced. And so a lot of youth are just confused about the indeterminate sentencing process, and then they get, you know, frustrated and feel hopeless, and keeping those youth engaged in a juvenile detention setting can be very hard because some of them finish high school in detention. We have a couple youth working on their college degrees here in detention, and that is unique for a juvenile detention center that is supposed to, our average length of stay, aside from those extreme cases, is about 22 days. And so adding those youth in, it's just a shift both for our staff and for the youth who see other people come and go and they're wondering why they're stuck.
The resources to accommodate that
Correct.
are not, I mean, the county juvenile justice system wasn't meant to hold kids for that long.
Correct. And we have had to be very creative, such as the college piece. That's not something that we were offering prior to 2023. And so now we are offering, and we had a success story. We had a youth who started their college career here in detention. They were sentenced to OYA, adjudicated to OYA, and then they were able to continue their college career at McLaren, and they had a B. They finished out the semester with a B, despite the transition from detention to McLaren. So there are some success stories, and of course it's unfortunate that, you know, they're here for so long.
Do you have, you don't have to share this now, but do you have data that shows any length of stays prior to now, like anything that shows the length of stays were shorter, now they're this kind of thing on average? Okay.
Yes, I can get that to you.
That would be awesome. And then what are some of the other things that the department, I know you weren't here before that, but I'm sure you've learned, what are some of the other ways that the departments had to adapt to that change?
So we have a unit that is specifically for Measure 11, and typically that unit was, they supervised the high-risk youth, and all of the Measure 11 cases fell into the high-risk category without a risk assessment. And so where we've adapted is that the different types of cases that would have qualified as Measure 11, where we're moving towards is that the crime doesn't determine the risk level, right? And so before we were focused on what the crime was, and we would supervise based on what the crime was, not necessarily what the youth's risk is and their associations, etc. And so focusing now more on the youth and their risk level is something that we've been focused on. Also engaging the family more in our case management planning. That's something that we are embarking upon. Of course, with the assistance with Annie Casey, we are embarking upon this family engaged case planning journey along with our transforming probation initiatives. And there's been a conversation that's happened for several years about the length of stay for youth on probation, being supervised on probation, or over supervising youth and not providing them with the right amount of case management, if you will, or resources or referrals, both early on and later on, and how that impacts the length of stay on probation. So there's a multidisciplinary team here in Multnomah County that has been meeting for several years to talk about this transformation of probation, and they started pre-SB 1008, and they have been, with Annie E. Casey, have been really transformative in where we're going in terms of the number of court conditions, etc. Those have been reduced.
What about these risk levels? What can you tell me about what some of these added risk elements are if you're not looking at the crime type?
Sure. So, of course, the crime type will weigh in at some point, but really risk involves criminogenic needs. So do they have support in the house? Do they have affiliations with negative peers? Is there substance abuse? Is there stable housing even? Is there, trying to think of all of them off the top of my head, but really just what would classify a youth with peers, school, work, etc. if those dynamics are measured in terms of the risk and need. I don't know if that answered.
Yeah, so then how much of an element is the type of crime committed? I mean, if you have somebody coming in who is accused of a homicide-related crime, how is that being calculated when the judge is making a decision?
That's a part of the risk scale. So what we use is the JCP, which is the Juvenile Crime Prevention Risk Score, and it's a statewide standardized assessment tool that it's validated, and it's something that I believe all 36 counties are utilizing. And in that risk assessment, there is a measure for the type of crime, and then how that weighs in with all of the other factors, it's taken into consideration. But the other factors also play a key role in how the risk level turns out at the end.
With how much you have been impacted on all sides of this, right? You've been the victim of crimes, it sounds like from what you said, have also been the perpetrator, and then changing, going to college and doing. How does this impact the way that you interact with youth? What are some of the lessons that you've learned that you bring to the table with that?
Well, in my current role, it's not quite often that I get to interact with youth, and so I always have to remember why I got into this field, and my why is the youth and families and wanting to help and give back to my community. So I always have to remember that, but when you're in a position that is an executive level position, usually it's the staff, right, and the managers and leading leaders. And so what I realize is that if you are not pouring into those who are taking care of the youth and the families, if you're not focusing on their well-being, then it's really hard for them to be able to focus on others' well-being. And so in my role, I have a unique privilege of being able to lead leaders and lead others to make sure that we're on the right track and that we're not causing more harm to families, as we know that the system causes harm, and being honest about that and how we go about supporting youth families. It really starts with our staff, and we don't say who gets to come into the system, right? We can't determine who's coming into our doors, but we do have control over how we're treating them when they're here, especially in detention. We don't know at the point of entry, we don't know what they've gone through before coming into these doors. And so it's really important that we maintain the focus on youth and that we're not a jail, we're not a prison, that we do have a responsibility to kids. And so I think that is a big difference when you talk to, for example, the adult side of the house. It's a very different treatment of youth when they're detained in a detention center.
How is it different?
Youth, adolescent brain science, right? At the age of, I believe researchers have said 25, your brain matures, which there's a lot of question around that. But at 25, youth under the age of 25, they haven't yet realized most of them haven't realized the decision-making function of the brain and the permanency of some of their decisions and some that are not. And so understanding that when you're working with youth, that their understanding of situations is different than it is for adults. In addition to some of the processes that we have to undergo here in a detention setting, for example, strip searching, making sure that we are doing that in a way that is respectful and that we are adhering to all of the policies and procedures, and that it's not degrading, demeaning, and that it doesn't violate any child welfare, anything like that. Like, those are the things that we have to keep in mind in juvenile. We do have PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and we are required to report if there are any incidences of misconduct or abuse. So being mindful that that is something that happens in adult as well. They have PREA, and the criteria for the juvenile side is that we also make reports to the child welfare if there is any allegation of misconduct or abuse.
You guys have probably seen your numbers grown a lot. I mean, I know that the decision-making on the judge part has changed a lot when it comes to who goes to OIA versus who stays here at the county level. Can you talk a little bit about that shift, and is that something you've seen during your time here?
I have. So we have a multidisciplinary team process where if there's a possibility for a youth to have out-of-home placement with OIA, we have a multidisciplinary team that is comprised of people from the community, from people from the district attorney's office, public defenders, etc., Department of Human Services. It's a multidisciplinary group that talks about the case and about the youth. They have the youth and family participate as well about what would be best in terms of out-of-home placement. What we have seen in Oregon is a decline or decrease in overall crime rates, and juvenile crime included. However, the types of crimes, such as homicide and juveniles that are participating in such crimes, that has increased. And so in looking at how a youth is safe in the community, the conversations have shifted, because primarily before, it wasn't necessarily that youth were the ones that were the most likely to engage in activity both with weapons or other very high-risk crimes. And now we're seeing a shift in that, where we are seeing more juveniles, more youth who are engaging in higher risk behaviors with higher risk peers. So that is something that is notable that we've seen, and that's something that our multidisciplinary team talks about, is whether or not we believe a youth can be safe in the community. And if they can't, then how can either OYA or the Department of Human Services or the family create structure to keep them safe in the community?
Why do you think there has been that shift? What are some of the things that, I know you can't probably say for sure one thing or the other, but what are some of the things that you're noticing have changed that are maybe causing some of this?
You know, it's hard to say. It's a nationwide shift with juveniles being involved in more high-risk types of crime. It's definitely something that has been discussed in Chicago. It's been discussed in Colorado, where I'm from. And so we don't know what the phenomena is, aside from access. And also there are perhaps older peers or older folks in communities who sometimes have used youth because they know that youth get less punishment or sentencing. So youth have engaged in more high-risk crimes as a result of that. And so it's just, at this rate, it's anecdotal, right? Because it hasn't been widely studied as to why we're seeing now the risk. I can't help but talk about the pandemic too, and youth who were in their homes, and law enforcement. In here in Portland, there was a lot of things that impacted youth in terms of the riot and the pandemic. And so there's a lot of different things that could have contributed to what we're seeing now, and it's hard to say.
When it comes to the size of this department, has that grown as judges have become more? I've heard that there's the tendency now to try and keep folks in the county services whenever possible when the crime is not to the level of homicide, for example, maybe. You guys probably have seen a lot of growth in that, right, population-wise?
We have. It's hard to say because the overall numbers of crime have decreased since the pandemic, since 2020. So the overall numbers look different than what they are, but the types of cases that we're seeing for longer, those have increased, like the types that are more high risk, if that makes sense. That is something that we're seeing a difference with. In terms of Multnomah County, we have really been working with our judges to reduce the court conditions here. So we have 3 court conditions, but also per judge's discretion, they can increase those conditions as well. We have a very active bench in our family law group, our family law judges, and they are great participants and great partners, thought partners in how any of our changes that we make in the Juvenile Services Division may or may not impact the bench. And so we have active conversations. We have a practitioners meeting, and the bench has been a partner in all of our transforming probation conversations. So when we're talking about the way that we're supervising youth who are pre-adjudicated, what we can and can't do for those youth looks very different than what we can and can't do for youth who are post-adjudication. And so working with them about what their expectations are for youth who have certain risk levels is something that requires a very active conversation and dialogue, and also, needs thought partners, multidisciplinary thought partners. So,
when it comes to teenagers, youth involved in gangs, how has that shifted throughout the years, and what do you guys do to monitor that?
Well, so it's tough because with gangs, and I'm an advocate to make sure that we don't further stigmatize or push youth down a path. And so tracking data related to susceptibility to being gang involved is not something that we specifically track. Now we track dynamics of perhaps there could be involvement with risky peer groups or subgroups or antisocial groups, but keeping specific data related to gangs, it's not something that we are doing. And I know that it has been done previously in Portland, and it may be something that's done by specific law enforcement agencies. But within our juvenile department, of course, we partner very, very closely with law enforcement, PPB, Gresham, and others to understand the risks related to certain cases and certain youth, especially as we're going out in the field. Our staff are in the field. And so we partner with them, but keeping track of the data around gang-related activity is not something that we specifically focus on within our division. I will say that you'll get a different answer if you ask the district attorney's office or the bench even. The answer may look different.
What are some of the big risk factors, in your opinion, with youth prior to justice involvement? What are some of the primary reasons why youth end up getting justice involved, for example?
A large majority is what we've found in what research says is that lack of education, like close ties to education or familial ties, connection, is something that has pushed youth to the juvenile justice system. Also, the school to prison pipeline is one that people have talked about. And it's cliche, I think, right now to say that, because there are several steps in the middle, right? And there are people who may believe that the juvenile system is not necessarily punitive enough, if you will. And I think that those folks who push back on that ideology that the juvenile system is not punitive and that it needs to be more punitive, it needs to be more prison-like and jail-like, only further perpetuates that thought of school to prison pipeline. Because anytime you're involved in our system, right, whether it's child welfare or if it's the juvenile justice or criminal justice field, you're already impacted by the system. And youth who are already impacted by the system, we know that a majority of them end up further penetrating the system. And a unique, interesting data point from the Oregon Child Welfare Department of Data, the OCID.
I've never heard of this.
It's the Oregon Child Information Database, I believe.
Okay.
And it's through the Department of Human Services through Oregon. Okay. And so they have statistics on the overall numbers of youth who come in contact with child welfare. And they pulled a number recently that shows that over half of all kids in Oregon have had some point of contact with a system, with child welfare mostly. And of that half, three-fourths of those youth come down the juvenile justice pipeline. And so that's a big number. It's a large percentage. And so what we know is that we have to work very closely with our child welfare partners. And we have a really great relationship with child welfare here in Multnomah County. We have a crossover youth practice model that we've engaged in, that we talk about if there's multi-system involvement, how we best serve the youth and their family so that we're not duplicating services or further harming families. So, yeah.
So you're saying a large number of the kids that have either been taken from their families by DHS or
had a referral
are ending up in juvenile justice.
3/4 are, so over half of Oregon's youth, all of them, have contact with child welfare. And of that half, 3/4 end up in the juvenile justice system. And so
it's like a systemic failure. Something happens in that system that fails them, that they continue to.
It could be. It's multifaceted, I believe. And, it may be when you have a referral to the hotline, child welfare, it doesn't mean that they're going to open the case, but you've already been impacted by the system. And what happens after that, it's different for every family depending on, you know, where they are, what their needs are, criminogenic risk factors, or just basic need factors. And so it could be that there's a referral based on housing. It could be child abuse. It could be a myriad of different things. So it's hard to say where a failure may be. And yeah.
One of the statistics I'm also looking at is a large number of children that are in Oregon's juvenile justice system have IEPs.
Yes.
What do you make of that statistic? What do you think that's saying about how the system works?
I don't think that IEPs are bad. They're support mechanisms. And I think that here in juvenile detention, a majority of our youth have IEPs or are supposed to have IEPs. And so I think that, you know, partnering with the education team to ensure that needs are met, individual needs are met, mental health needs, there's a lot of conversation about the impact of the pandemic and what that did to kids who are in elementary, middle, and high school now. Well, middle and high school, I guess, late elementary. What that's done for them in terms of their mental health and their well-being. And IEPs can be broad. I have kindergartners, 2 of them, who are on IEPs. And so it just depends on what the situation is and what the needs are. But I think that, you know, having more supports for youth, especially right now post-pandemic or after 2020, I should say, that there is a huge need for more individualized support and mental health support.
I mean, obviously, like, correlation doesn't equal causation, but Oregon also has a very high number of children who have special needs in schools. Correct. When you look at Oregon's school system versus other states. And we also have a academic funding formula that doesn't take into consideration those weights necessarily as well as others do, according to national studies. I don't know if you've seen some of that recent stuff on how Oregon's funding formula really doesn't weight that properly. How do you think that's a big picture in and of itself? What do you think about that?
In terms of the funding piece, you know, I can't help but to think about the state of Oregon's funding as it sits right now in that question, right? And what the impacts will be given the governor's projected shortfall and how that might impact education in general. And so it's really hard to think about the what if and what will and what has been, because you just never know in terms of how the funding formulas will be impacted by some of the greater conversations, both state, local, and federal.
I mean, you've worked in this arena a long time, and you've been impacted by it in many ways as a child as well. If you were to point to a couple of solutions, I know you don't have the answers to everything, but you've got a lot of experience. What do you think are some of the primary ways that we're failing children in Oregon, and what would you point to as solutions?
I would say I don't want to pinpoint Oregon, right? Because I feel like, especially being in Portland, we are on the I-5 corridor, and we see quite often kids who are passing through from California to Washington or even from Mexico to Canada. And so I don't want to speak just for the failure of Oregon, because I think that systemic wide, right, there's an impact in Oregon. What I will say, though, is the racial disparity data is something that is eye-opening when you look at the national statistics, in addition to the juvenile commitment rates and incarceration rates. Oregon ranks number 2 nationwide for commitment and incarceration for youth. And so when I look at that data and look at who's impacted by the decisions that are being made, it's largely people who look like me, right? People who, youth of color and their families. And in Oregon, in a place where the demographics overall are not reflective of those who are impacted by the system, it's something for us to keep in mind, I think, and also being very aware of everything we do, the impact that has long-term on the community, on the youth, on the families. All the decisions that we make have a greater impact. It's like a ripple effect. And so in the Juvenile Justice Policy Commission, I'm really excited to work with a myriad of different stakeholders who are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate to focus on juvenile justice policy specifically. And this is a new task force that was created, a new commission that was created in 2023, I believe, and enacted in 2024. And it was really pushed by Representative Crop, and he's given a vision for what he would like to see from this commission, from that commission, and how we can all be more informed on juvenile justice and focused on juvenile justice and the impacts of legislation and policy, and having a deeper, wider conversation. It's exciting to be a part of that group because we are delving into data more. We are talking about the racial disparity and the fact that Oregon has been a leader in so many different arenas for juvenile justice and child welfare, and Multnomah County in particular has been seen as a model by Annie E. Casey for transforming probation work. And so in uplifting, in JDAI, I should say, so Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiatives. So uplifting the work that we have done that has been great in Oregon, part of it brought me here, right? Like knowing the model that Multnomah County was for JDAI and wanting to work specifically within that structure is something that's important, but also realizing that we have opportunities to improve. So recognizing that we've done a lot of great and that there are still a lot of opportunities to get better and do things in a way that advances with the time, if that makes sense.
When it comes to stopping the flow of youth into the justice system, what are some of the things that you think this society should be focused on?
Well, the first step, most of the time, is law enforcement, right? And education with law enforcement around juvenile justice impact and juvenile justice policy, I think, is important. Oftentimes, youth are coming because of their interaction with law enforcement. And, as I mentioned before, we don't say who comes into our system. However, we are responsible for while they're here. And so part of it, I believe, is education. The other part is having more opportunities for partnership in the community. So really leaning on our partners and community agencies to be mentors, to have positive pro-social programming for youth, and really tapping into programs like Boys and Girls Club or other pro-social activities, I think, is absolutely a preventive measure that I know that there is a push here in Multnomah County for better collaboration and partnership with community agencies. I know that funding is one that has been a challenge, especially with federal grants in serving specific communities. That has been a challenge, and so really figuring out creative ways to ensure that community partners have the resources they need to be able to provide the upstream support that so many of our kids need.
When you talk about pro-social programs, I want to break that down into language people understand more. I mean, you're talking about Boys and Girls Clubs, after-school programs. How many of these programs are culturally inclusive? I can't tell you exactly how many exist currently in Oregon, but I can tell you that anecdotally,
I know of several that are culturally responsive, and
are the resources allocated equitably in that way?
I can only speak from Multnomah, from my spot where I sit in juvenile, if they're allocated appropriately. I think at this moment, all of our community providers need some more support. They need additional resources, especially those who are culturally responsive providers, given many of them had federal grants that were either cut or are proposed to be cut. And so there's no trying to figure out the funding to make up for the grants that they may not be receiving now is something that we're discussing widely. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the fear in some communities now in participating in any activity given the landscape, if
what
that
do you
makes
mean?
sense. The landscape, I'll say the federal landscape and the impact of the federal landscape to the local jurisdiction and the fear of not having the proper documentation or
So you're concerned that because of mixed documentation status in a family, people might be fearful of engaging in services?
correct.
Okay. And then can you speak to some of the funding cuts that have specifically targeted DEI programs or any program that caters to a specific population, right? I mean, because that is what's under fire here.
That's
and when you're talking about disequitable outcomes in the justice system, can you talk about, can you go through the process and kind of break it down piece by piece a little bit?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know. And feel free to take time to think about how to do this. But I mean, I'm just thinking about if we're talking about this problem's getting worse in disequitable outcomes for children who are justice involved, higher numbers of Black and brown kids who are justice involved, and then you're also taking away these programs. So I just want to connect those dots a little.
Yeah, so it's hard because Multnomah County did not receive any federal funding. So our programs were not cut as a result of any federal changes. The funding that we do receive that is federal is based on our school nutrition program for detention. So that hasn't seen any change. I know in my peer counties, so for example in Washington County, they have had impacts to their service delivery based on the federal funding changes. So it's hard for me to say what that is because we haven't experienced that level of change, if you will. I do know that one of our providers, POIC, they received a certain number of federal funding dollars, and some of their programs have had an impact because of the changes and reduction in funding. I know that there was an email, so anecdotally, there was an email that went out saying to some of the agencies saying that if you serve clients who do not have proper documentation, then you will not receive funding. And so I didn't receive that email, but it's something that I've heard that has impacted a peer county. And so I can't speak to how they've worked through some of that with their providers because we haven't had to. Of course, the county general fund is one that definitely supports the work that we do and the resources and referrals that we make to our community providers. I will say that at one point, our detention facility housed Washington County and Clackamas County youth. And as a result of funding changes and our costs rising and their budgets decreasing, they made a decision to change, and they are no longer contracting with Multnomah County to house their youth. They're contracting with Marion County. So youth from Washington County and Clackamas County who were housed here are now in Marion County. And a large part of that is the funding implication. And I can specifically say for Washington County, realizing that they weren't going to get certain grants, they had to make some hard decisions and make some changes. And so that's an example of a partner county having to make a decision that impacts youth that are now in Marion County.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about justice-involved youth?
That they're bad is one, and that, that they are not able to change. one of the reasons why I am so passionate and so much in love with the field that I chose is because I know that there's resiliency in youth and juveniles, and that there is the possibility for change. And I'm a great example of being someone who changed and had the right supports to do that, and really leaned on my teachers, who were a great support for me to move forward and want to continue my education, and help me with pro-social activities and skills to not engage in some of the behaviors that I was engaging in. So I know the importance of having those connections and what that can do from a firsthand experience. And, you know, I would say that youth of color, although they are the most represented in the system, it's unfortunate that that is the case, and I don't have a magic wand to change that. In Portland, I know that we are the smallest in geographic size, but the largest in population. And the youth of color here, and the youth that we serve in our detention center, are the highest in the state. And I wish I had a magic wand for how youth of color are pushed through the system, and a magic wand to prevent that from happening. But I wish I had the answer. All I can think to say is to continue collaborating with community, also having conversations and partnering with different stakeholders, community partners, also having youth have their voices be heard in decisions that are made about them and for them. I think that those are the things that we can do to help in any case. We can uplift those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, that there are parents that have been impacted by, and families that have been impacted by youth violence.
Sure.
That feel like the county and the state are not doing enough to hold those kids accountable and make sure they don't reoffend, because, you know, some people's kids have died at the hands of somebody who was released for another crime. What would you tell those parents about how this system is working?
You know, the victim piece, families who've been impacted by the system, you know, I would say that there is nothing that can bring back the loss of a loved one. There's an imbalance, I think, when, for example, we have court hearings and oftentimes we're talking about the progress of a youth who maybe has done something to significantly harm a family, and the family is in the court hearing, hearing about the progress of the youth in detention or in the community, and their loved one may not be here as a result of that youth's actions. Like, there's no words for that. And I think that the restorative justice piece is something that we focus on here a lot in Multnomah County, and that, you know, the harm is there. We recognize it. We acknowledge that there is harm, and working through that with skilled facilitators and others is something that we've found tremendous benefit for. I know that there's a lot of families and others who are impacted by crime, by juvenile crime, that may not be willing to engage in that restorative practice piece, but it's something that has been really profound and beneficial. And the research has shown that not only does the restorative justice piece benefit the youth, or I would say the youth in this case, but also give some healing to the family in the acknowledgement of the crime or the harm that was done. And so I think uplifting the mechanism for the restorative piece to live, and how we can improve upon those programs and have more of those programs, also having those programs live outside of the system is important. But I think that's one thing that I would say is just focusing more on restorative practices, restorative justice programs to help in terms of the victim impact, if you will.
What would you say to the people who feel like the county just hasn't held them long enough, hasn't held them accountable enough, and that's why they're going out and committing other crimes?
I don't think there's a prescribed amount of time that you can hold anyone, right, in the criminal justice system for them to not recidivate. Regardless of what you put in place, electronic monitoring and all of the other facets of community supervision, someone could go out and commit another crime for a myriad of different reasons, and we don't have to go into all of those right now. But I would say that for the youth that I used as an example of being here for over 900 days, given our average length of stay is 22 days, if that youth was released, the one who's been here for 900 days in juvenile detention, and they go out and commit another crime, the question would be, should they have stayed in juvenile detention longer? Should they have been supervised differently while out in the community? Should they have been connected to a community partner for mentoring or pro-social activity? Would any of those things have changed the outcome of the situation? Maybe. It's hard to say. It's complex, if that makes sense.
Okay, last question. It's kind of a double point question, but hardest part of your job and your favorite part of your job?
I would say the hardest part of my job, moving here from Colorado, is really learning and understanding Oregon and Portland, and recognizing too that although Multnomah County is one of 36, our voice sometimes can be the loudest of the 36 because of the sheer population and the numbers. And so learning to navigate and really be mindful of my partner counties and learning about folks in other counties who have smaller departments who are experiencing very similar challenges, but they look different. Listening to them and learning from them has been not a challenge, but it's something that I have really been intentional on trying to understand all of the nuances of Oregon and the different counties. In Colorado, it was different because the juvenile detention and the commitment centers were all under the same state department. And so here, juvenile detention being one of 36, that has been an adjustment to learn and also sometimes sit back and just say, you know, I can't speak for all 36 counties, and you will get a different response about why juvenile crime happens in every single county. You'll have a different response, but I can just speak from my experience and remembering that there is a bigger picture and that I'm just one of 36 plus OYA. That is something that I have to be very mindful of. I would say that the thing that excites me about this work, there's so many things. Juvenile is my passion. I don't want to go anywhere else. I love my juvenile world because of the hope that is there in partnering with families, with staff, with others, with youth. Youth are incredibly, again, resilient, and having conversations with youth impacted by our system in various spaces, both in detention or in probation diversion. Having conversations with them is the best part of my day. I also am really driven because I'm raising 4 young Black boys, and I want the system better for them as they get older, because I would never want them to experience systems in the ways that I have, but if they do, I want it to be a system that is better than what I came into it with.